A little girl vanished in the time it takes to fold a towel. No screams, no struggle, just gone. It was the kind of spring afternoon that stays burned in memory forever. Not because anything seemed wrong at first, but because everything felt so perfectly normal before the world shattered. Frankfort, Kentucky. May 3rd, 1992. The air smelled like fresh cut grass mixed with sweet honeysuckle. Kids pedaled their tricycles down peaceful streets. Wind chimes sang softly in backyards. Nobody suspected that evil was already watching. 3-year-old Angelica Lewis sat on her family's front porch. Their small blue house on Riverview Lane looked like any other home on the block. She held her favorite stuffed bunny tight against her chest. Inside, her mother Carol was folding warm towels fresh from the dryer. The screen door stayed propped open. Through the kitchen window, Carol could see her daughter's little legs swinging back and forth. Pink sandals, white socks with ruffled lace. Just an ordinary Saturday afternoon? Carol glanced at her daughter twice in 10 minutes. Everything seemed fine. She looked up at the clock on the wall. 2:47 p.m., then she turned back to finish the laundry. The third time she looked outside, Angelica was gone. At first, the empty porch didn't fully register in Carol's mind. She called her daughter's name. Maybe Angelica had wandered into the yard chasing a butterfly. Maybe she went around the side of the house to pick dandelions. Carol stepped outside and called again, louder this time. But only silence answered back. No childish laughter. No little footsteps on the wooden porch. The street lay completely still. Then reality crashed down like a wave. Carol dropped the basket of towels and ran outside screaming, "Angelica! Angie, where are you?" Her desperate voice echoed down the quiet road. A neighbor watering her garden stopped mid-spray and turned toward the sound. Within minutes, half the neighborhood rushed over to help. People checked behind fences and under porches. They searched inside garages and sheds. But the little girl in pink sandals had disappeared without making a single sound. By 3:30 that afternoon, the first police car pulled up. Within 1 hour, the peaceful street transformed into chaos. Marked patrol cars lined both sides of the road. Red and blue lights flashed against house windows. Officers walked shoulder to shoulder through every backyard in a grid pattern. Detectives stretched yellow crime scene tape around the property. Volunteers spread out in groups, heading toward the nearby woods. Search dogs arrived with their handlers, barking commands as they pushed through thick brush behind the Lewis home. The trail led toward the tree line running along the Kentucky River. At 6:10 p.m., a police helicopter circled overhead. Its powerful spotlight swept back and forth across the darkening landscape below. The river glittered in the fading light, looking deceptively peaceful and calm. Crowds of onlookers gathered behind the barricades. Everyone whispered the same terrifying question. How does a child vanish in broad daylight from her own front porch? The search continued all through the night. Officers found absolutely nothing, no signs of any struggle. No footprints in the dirt, no dropped toys. Not even a single broken twig to show which direction Angelica might have gone. Then hours later, someone made a disturbing discovery, her stuffed bunny. The one she never let go of. It was sitting on the porch, positioned perfectly upright, almost like someone had carefully placed it there. Detective Paul Garner was one of the first responders on scene. Years later, he would say that detail haunted him most. It wasn't tossed aside. It wasn't accidentally dropped. It was deliberately set down, like someone didn't want her mom to notice right away that she was gone. The next morning brought even more searchers. Police expanded the search perimeter wider. Dozens of volunteers combed through open fields and walked along riverbanks. Divers in wet suits swept the shallow water near the old fishing pier. They found nothing. By the third day, search teams had covered a 3-mile radius in every direction. They used infrared heat scanners, horseback units, trained K-9 teams. Still, there was absolutely no trace of Angelica Lewis anywhere. Then investigators caught their first and only real lead. An elderly neighbor named Mrs. Hennon came forward with information. She told officers she had seen a white sedan parked at the end of the Lewis driveway. The time was around 2:40 p.m. She couldn't identify the exact make or model of the car, only that the driver appeared to be a man wearing a baseball cap. and that the vehicle was gone when she looked again later. Police immediately canvassed nearby counties looking for matching vehicles. They pulled registration lists, interviewed dozens of owners, set up roadblocks along US Route 60. Tips flooded in from locals claiming they had seen similar white cars in the area. But every single lead fell apart under closer investigation. By the end of the week, a heavy, hopeless weight had settled over the case. The kind that comes with small-town tragedies that never get solved. The neighborhood changed overnight. Families who once left doors unlocked now closed their blinds tight. They double-checked every lock before bed. Parents started walking their children to school instead of letting them go alone. News reporters camped near the Lewis property, waiting desperately for any sign of progress. But progress never came. Detectives worked through every possible theory. Family abduction? There were no custody disputes to investigate. Random kidnapping? Extremely unlikely for this quiet area. Stranger crime? Possible but rare. There were no witnesses beyond Mrs. Hennon's vague description. No ransom demand ever arrived. No suspicious phone calls. No physical evidence linking any person to the disappearance. It felt like Angelica had simply been lifted out of existence and completely erased from the world. Carol and her husband David appeared on local television 1 week later. They made an emotional plea for their daughter's safe return. Carol's voice shook as she spoke directly to the camera. "Please, whoever has her, just bring her home. She's only 3 years old. She must be so scared without her bunny." That heartbreaking clip would replay for years whenever Frankfort residents discussed the case. Her red eyes, her hands clasped desperately together, holding on to hope when hope seemed impossible. For months afterward, the investigation consumed the entire community. Flyers with Angelica's photo appeared everywhere. Grocery stores, gas stations, post offices. The picture showed a smiling toddler with light brown curls. Detectives chased down every possible sighting reported. A girl matching her description in Bowling Green, another one in Cincinnati, one reported near a rest stop in Tennessee. Each time the lead ended in crushing disappointment. By autumn, everything shifted. The search base shut down permanently. Volunteers returned to their regular jobs. Reporters moved on to cover other stories. The only people who refused to stop searching were the Lewis family and Detective Garner. He kept the case file open on his desk long after other investigators closed theirs. The official report listed the disappearance as suspected abduction with an active ongoing investigation. But behind closed doors, the task force understood the grim reality. Without physical evidence or credible witnesses, the odds of finding Angelica alive were slipping away with each passing day. The final major search effort happened in November 1992. Divers went back into the river one more time. A fisherman had claimed he spotted a small pink shoe caught in the reeds near the bank. The dive team found something, but it turned out to be worthless trash, a faded plastic doll shoe, sun-bleached and half-buried in river silt. After that discovery, silence fell over the case completely. Christmas arrived and passed that year without Angelica. Carol kept the porch light burning every single night without fail. She said it was so Angelica could find her way back home. David completely stopped speaking to reporters or journalists. The small blue house on Riverview Lane turned into a symbol of pure heartbreak. The place where a little girl disappeared in the middle of an ordinary day and never came back. By spring of 1993, the official search had finally ended for good. The Lewis file got added to dozens of other unsolved cases. Inside a locked evidence room at the Franklin County Sheriff's Department, Angelica's name showed up once a year on local missing children bulletins. Her photo got updated through age progression software every few years. The faces changed over time. The technology improved and got better, but the outcome never did at all. And yet, even decades later, investigators would say the case still haunted their minds. Because from the very beginning, something about it felt incomplete and wrong. Like a puzzle missing just one piece that made everything make sense. There was no scream heard, no struggle found, no trace left behind. Just a porch, a stuffed bunny sitting upright, and a mother who looked away for less than a minute. No one knew it back then, but the mystery that began on that quiet street in 1992 would remain buried and hidden for more than 2 decades until years later. A forgotten box and a single handwritten letter would finally reveal what really happened to Little Angelica Lewis that day. In the months after Angelica disappeared from their lives, the Lewis home became quiet in a way that felt completely unnatural. The toys on the porch never moved or shifted again. The flower pots Carol had once tended to with care began to wilt one by one. The sound of laughter that had once filled every room was replaced by a silence that stretched across years and years. For a long time, Carol refused to believe her daughter was actually gone forever. She kept Angelica's room exactly as it had been that day. The same pastel walls, the same stuffed animals lined up perfectly on the windowsill. Every night she would open the door quietly, sit at the edge of the bed, and whisper goodnight to a child who never answered back. The neighbors said it was like the house had stopped aging completely. Frozen in 1992 forever, David Lewis, her husband, carried the grief in a completely different way. He was at work the day Angelica vanished without a trace, a mechanic at a local auto shop off Wilkinson Boulevard, and that detail would haunt him for decades to come. He told friends he should have been there at home, that maybe if he'd come home early or taken a different shift that day, things would have gone differently. Over time, guilt hollowed him out from the inside. He stopped talking about the case entirely, stopped sitting beside Carol when she appeared on the evening news begging for answers, and began spending long hours alone in the garage, fixing engines that didn't even need fixing at all. In those early years, Frankfort police worked tirelessly to find any answers they could. There were phone lines dedicated solely to Angelica's case alone, and volunteers handed out missing posters as far away as Lexington and beyond. But as weeks turned into months without progress, the case began to unravel into confusion and deep frustration. Every time detectives thought they had a solid lead, it collapsed into absolutely nothing. One tip came from a truck driver who claimed to have seen a child matching Angelica's exact description at a rest stop outside Bowling Green. When officers followed up quickly, the sighting turned out to be a local girl traveling with her aunt on vacation. Another tip came from a woman in Nashville who believed she'd seen Angelica in a park with a man who didn't look like her father at all. Surveillance footage showed nothing helpful. Every lead seemed to dissolve as soon as it appeared on their desk. Then came the phone calls, dozens of them from people who claimed to have information about Angelica. Some were sincere and genuine, some were cruel and heartless, and a few were simply unexplainable and strange. One caller told police he had taken Angelica from the porch, then laughed loudly before hanging up the phone. Another claimed she was being held in an abandoned farmhouse near Lawrenceburg waiting to be found. When officers got there with backup, the property was empty except for raccoons and broken furniture scattered around. In desperation, Carol turned to anyone who would listen to her story. She went on local talk shows, appeared on early internet forums dedicated to missing children cases, even consulted psychics who promised to feel Angelica's energy from beyond. Every time she walked away with more hope than actual answers. Detectives didn't discourage her at all. They knew that hope was sometimes the only thing families had left to hold on to. But behind the scenes, investigators were running out of places to look for clues. By 1997, 5 years after the disappearance happened, the original task force had been disbanded completely. The sheriff's department merged the case into a growing list of long-term missing persons files sitting in storage. It became a case number instead of a name anymore. KY 921437, one of many forgotten files, that same year. Carol began organizing yearly candlelight vigils on the anniversary of Angelica's disappearance from their lives. At first, dozens of people came to show support. Friends, neighbors, church members, even strangers who'd followed the case in the local news. But as time went on year after year, the crowd grew smaller and smaller. By 2000, it was just Carol and 2 other families from nearby towns who had lost children of their own to similar tragedies. The human toll was impossible to ignore anymore. David moved into the guest room, sometime around 1998 without much discussion. He told people he couldn't sleep near the window that faced the front porch anymore. The sight of the empty step where Angelica used to sit swinging her legs was too much to bear. Their marriage became mechanical and cold. Polite conversations about bills, short exchanges about dinner plans, but no laughter, no warmth between them at all. Friends noticed the change. Some said it was like living with two ghosts under the same roof together. Detectives who revisited the case over the years tried to bring fresh eyes to it. They re-interviewed neighbors who might remember something new, rechecked the area where the white sedan had allegedly been seen that afternoon, and even reached out to the FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit for insight and help. But nothing changed the central fact of the case. There was no physical evidence anywhere, no DNA samples, no fingerprints found, no confirmed sighting that held up. The case was like smoke in the air, visible in memory, impossible to hold in your hands. In 2001, a new lead briefly reignited hope for the family. A woman in Ohio reported that a teenage girl had come into her store looking disoriented and barefoot, claiming she didn't know who she was or where she came from. When shown a photo of Angelica, as she might look at 13 years old, the resemblance was uncanny and striking. Detectives drove 6 hours straight to meet the girl in person, only to discover she was a runaway from Illinois with a different past. The hope that had flickered for a few days went out again just as quickly as it came. Around that same time, a detective named Harold Grant, a young officer newly assigned to the Cold Case Division, began cataloging older files in storage. He remembered seeing the Lewis case in the archive room stacked between other unsolved disappearances from past decades. He'd later admit that it stood out to him because of how thin the file actually was compared to others. There wasn't enough there, he said later. It was like they were missing a piece that should have been obvious to everyone. But with no new evidence found, his hands were tied completely. By 2002. 10 years had passed since Angelica vanished from her porch. The sheriff's office officially closed the Lewis case as inactive without warning, meaning it could be reopened if new information surfaced someday, but otherwise it was shelved indefinitely. Carol was informed in a brief letter sent by mail, 1 paragraph total, stating there were no further leads to pursue, and the department extended its condolences to the family. She kept that letter folded inside a Bible on her nightstand for years, reading it whenever she needed to remind herself that Angelica was still somewhere in the world, even if no one knew where anymore. That same year, a new missing children's campaign launched statewide across Kentucky. It featured age-progressed digital composites of children who had disappeared throughout the 1990s without a trace. Angelica's face appeared among them on posters, a computer-generated rendering of what she might look like at 13 years old. Longer hair, older eyes, but the same small smile she had. Carol said the picture didn't feel like her daughter at all. "They made her older," she told a reporter who asked, "but I still see her as 3. That's how she always be to me." As the years stretched on, Angelica's name became a familiar line in small-town newspapers every spring, a yearly reminder in the Missing Children of Kentucky section that ran every May without fail. People who had once known the family personally moved away to other states. The reporters who'd covered the case extensively retired from journalism. Even the neighbor who'd claimed to see the white sedan passed away in 2005 peacefully, inside the Lewis home. Time had stopped moving forward entirely. Carol worked part-time at a diner on the edge of town for minimum wage, a job that kept her from thinking too long between shifts about her daughter. David drifted further into silence and isolation. Their marriage eventually ended in an unspoken separation when he left one evening in 2007 without much warning, leaving behind only a note on the kitchen counter that read simply, "I can't live in this house anymore." Carol never filed for divorce officially. She just stopped referring to herself as married to anyone. Detectives would occasionally recheck the case when time allowed it, but each review came back the same disappointing way. No suspects identified, no physical evidence recovered, no progress made whatsoever. It became one of those names mentioned at conferences as an example of how time can swallow even the most haunting mysteries whole. And yet, through all those silent years passing by, the files stayed in the same drawer location, marked by fading ink and rusted staples holding papers together. Angelica's photograph, the one taken on her third birthday party, remained clipped to the front of the folder. The little girl with the bright smile and pink sandals, still waiting in a way for someone to find her wherever she was. No one knew it back then. But the next time that file would be opened more than 15 years later, it wouldn't be because of a new lead or witness coming forward. It would be because of a simple clerical task nobody wanted, an old detective sorting through forgotten boxes in storage, and a single Polaroid photo that had gone unnoticed for decades somehow. Something was about to resurface quietly from the shadows, like a voice returning from the past calling out. By 2017, the case of 3-year-old Angelica Lewis had faded into the quiet background of Kentucky's long list of unsolved disappearances over the years. Her name lived mostly in old newspaper archives and cold case databases online, just another statistic from another decade that passed. Inside the Franklin County Sheriff's Department building, her file sat buried among hundreds of others in a windowless evidence room, where dust gathered on boxes that hadn't been touched in years or decades. That summer, Harold Grant, a retired detective nearing 70 years old, volunteered to help the department digitize its old evidence storage system. He'd served over 30 years on the force total, long enough to know that most cold cases ended in silence, not answers for families. Still, he believed in something that many younger detectives had forgotten over time. Sometimes the smallest, most overlooked details held the truth everyone was searching for desperately. He worked methodically every day, labeling and scanning every file he opened carefully. The boxes were old and damaged, some collapsing under their own weight when moved. The handwriting on their labels had faded to pale pencil smudges barely readable. Johnson B. 1985, Teller J. 1979, unidentified Lake Cumberland. 1988 with question marks, then, near the bottom of a leaning stack against the wall, he spotted one that caught his eye immediately. The tag read Lewis A. 1992 in blocky letters. He remembered the name immediately without thinking twice. The missing girl from Frankfort, the one whose case had once made headlines across the entire state. He had never worked the investigation himself directly, but everyone in law enforcement back then knew the story by heart. 3 years old, vanished from her porch in daylight. No trace ever found anywhere. He lifted the lid carefully with both hands. Inside were plastic evidence sleeves yellowed with age and time, brittle paper reports that cracked when touched, and faded Polaroids clipped together. As he sorted through the contents slowly, something slipped out from between two reports unexpectedly. A small photograph warped and stained from time sitting in storage. It was a Polaroid, the kind you had to shake dry in the 90s to develop. It showed a little girl sitting on the edge of a dirt road beside a rural mailbox standing alone. The number painted on the side of the post read 417 in white paint. The child's face was partly turned away from the camera, but she appeared to be about 3 or 4 years old. Her head slightly tilted as if distracted by something out of frame that caught her attention. On the back of the photo, written in shaky pen ink, were 4 words that made his heart stop. Still close to home. Harold sat back in his chair slowly, studying it under the dim fluorescent light overhead. The handwriting was odd and uneven, almost hurried in appearance, like someone trying not to be recognized by their writing style. The note wasn't dated anywhere, but the film type suggested it was from the early 90s era. He checked the case file thoroughly. There was no mention of this Polaroid anywhere in any report. Curious now, he flipped through the old evidence log sheets until he found an entry dated June 1994, 2 years after Angelica disappeared without a trace. It referenced an anonymous envelope received by the sheriff's department years ago, addressed simply to Missing Persons Unit without any other details. The envelope had contained a Polaroid photo inside, no letter included, no return address written anywhere. A clerk had apparently forwarded it to the records division where it was supposed to be logged and processed properly. But somewhere in the chain of custody handling it, it had been misplaced and forgotten. The record showed no follow-up done, no analysis completed, no indication that any detective had ever seen it at all. A clerical oversight, really. One small forgotten detail buried under decades of paperwork piling up. Harold studied the image again, more carefully this time. The landscape behind the child was unmistakably rural Kentucky scenery. Rolling hills, low brush, a wooden fence stretching into the distance behind her. He noticed something else odd. The mailbox wasn't attached to a house at all. It stood alone on a dirt pull-off with no structure visible nearby anywhere. He zoomed in on the scanned version carefully, looking for any identifying features that could help. A tree line, a power pole, anything that might help locate it on a map. He opened the original property maps from the 1992 investigation sitting in files. Back then, search teams had covered a 5-mile radius from the Lewis residence on Riverview Lane, but no property with the number 417 appeared anywhere in that range searched. It didn't make sense at all. The number clearly existed somewhere, but where exactly? That phrase on the back, still close to home? It lingered in his mind long after he left the office that day and went home. Most anonymous tips were vague or sensational, seeking attention, but this one felt different somehow. It wasn't boasting about anything. It wasn't mocking the investigation. It sounded like someone confessing or hinting at truth, but with restraint and caution. The next morning, Harold pulled the full Lewis case file from the archive and brought it to his desk to review. It was heavier than he expected when lifting it. Nearly 400 pages of reports, transcripts, and witness statements compiled over years. The early entries detailed the search efforts thoroughly. The white sedan sighting, the interviews with neighbors around the area. Later pages grew sparse and thin, just annual updates recorded, each stamped with the same words. No new leads found. He read through it for hours without stopping. The deeper he went into it, the more it felt like reading a story that had stopped mid-sentence without ending. He found the old property search maps again laid out, and this time he noticed something others might have missed completely. There was a Route 417 listed in the area back then, a county access road that had been renamed in the early 2000s after flood. Damage destroyed several homes along the riverbanks. It wasn't a house number at all like everyone assumed. It was a route marker for a road still close to home. The words clicked in his mind suddenly. What if the photo wasn't pointing to a property address, but to a location on a map? What if the sender was trying to tell investigators that Angelica was still nearby somewhere, close to the river, close to where she'd vanished that afternoon? He began pulling old topographical maps from storage, overlaying them with the original search grid pattern used. The Lewis residence sat just over a mile from the Kentucky River near an area locals used to call Willow Bend back then. Route 417, before the renaming happened, had run parallel to the water line before looping toward a dead-end field nobody used. It had been abandoned for decades after a flood washed out part of the road completely. That name, Willow Bend, came up in the file too when he searched. It had been one of the first areas searched in 1992 by teams. Crews had spent 3 days there combing through everything, but found nothing at all. After the initial sweep was finished, it was ruled out and never revisited again by anyone. Harold leaned back in his chair, feeling uneasy about everything. It was possible the photo had nothing to do with the case at all. Anonymous mail wasn't uncommon in missing child investigations over the years. People sent fake photos, false tips, even cruel pranks to police. But this image had sat unnoticed in an evidence box for over 20 years collecting dust. No one had analyzed it properly. No one had cross-checked it against anything. And it had appeared 2 years after the disappearance happened, when media coverage had already faded away. Whoever sent it didn't do it for attention or fame. That evening, Harold stayed late in the office alone, scanning the Polaroid into the digital system and attaching it to the case file electronically. He wrote a short note to the department's cold case supervisor recommending the image for review immediately. But as he prepared to close the file for the night, he hesitated for a moment. Something in his gut told him this was important and real. He looked again at the child in the photograph closely. The posture, the size, the hair color, everything was consistent with a girl around 3 or 4 years old. He couldn't say for certain it was Angelica looking back, but something about it captured his attention. Some small resemblance in the eyes or tilt of the head was haunting him. Before leaving, he slipped a copy of the image into his notebook to take home. On the back, he wrote the same words that had been scrawled there decades earlier by someone. Still close to home, that night, as rain began to fall over Frankfort steadily, Harold couldn't shake the feeling that he'd just opened a door no one had dared touch in decades of silence. He didn't know it yet clearly, but that small faded photograph, the one everyone had overlooked for years, was about to change everything about this case, because buried within that message, hidden in plain sight for 23 years, was the first real clue to what had happened to Angelica Lewis that day. Every case on this channel takes weeks of research done, fact-checking sources, and long nights uncovering the truth behind mysteries. We do this because these stories matter deeply, and someone still deserves to be remembered by everyone. If you want us to keep bringing these real mysteries to light consistently, please like, subscribe, and share which part of today's case hit you hardest emotionally. For more solved cold cases, the links are waiting for you in the description below. Now, let's get back to the case immediately. In January of 2018, a plain white envelope arrived at the Frankfort Police Department without warning. There was nothing remarkable about it at first glance, really. No stamps beyond the standard issue, no return address written, and only 5 typed words scrawled across the front in uneven handwriting that looked rushed. To the mother of Angelica Lewis, the mail clerk assumed it was another old tip from a member of the public trying to help and placed it in the bin with routine correspondence coming in. It might have stayed there for days, maybe even weeks unnoticed, if a young officer hadn't recognized the name and brought it directly to Detective Harold Grant at his desk. Grant had spent the last several months quietly reviewing the Lewis case every chance he got. Unable to shake the image of that faded Polaroid from his mind, he was convinced the clue had meant something real, even if no one else believed him at all. The letter's arrival felt like a spark lighting up a long, cold room. When he tore open the envelope carefully, a single folded sheet of lined paper fell out onto his desk. It wasn't typed or printed professionally, just handwritten in a rushed, uneven script that looked shaky. It read clearly, "I watched her grow up, though she never knew me. She was loved. I couldn't let her go that night. She was supposed to be safe. I can't carry it anymore. Look near the river where the willows bend." There was no signature written, no date included, no explanation given anywhere. Grant read it twice before he said a word out loud. The tone was strange and haunting, neither threatening nor gloating about anything. It felt personal, remorseful, almost pleading for understanding. Whoever wrote it wasn't boasting about a crime they committed. They were confessing to something that had been eating away at them for years now. He immediately checked the postmark stamped on the envelope. It had been mailed from Nashville, Tennessee, less than 2 weeks earlier than today. He sent the envelope to the state forensic lab for analysis right away. The results came back within days with findings. The paper and ink were modern materials, manufactured no earlier than 2015, they confirmed. That meant the writer wasn't someone recounting an old rumor or hoax they heard. They were alive and had written it recently with purpose. Grant's mind turned to the line that stood out most clearly. "Look near the river where the willows bend." It wasn't just poetic phrasing someone chose. It was geography pointing somewhere specific. The phrase mirrored something in the old case files exactly, something from the early search maps used. In 1992, part of the investigation had focused near a riverside area locals called Willow Bend back then. A curving stretch of land along the Kentucky riverbanks, where search teams had combed through heavy brush and shallow water in the days after Angelica's disappearance without results. Nothing had been found back then at all, and after flood damage years later hit, the area had become overgrown and virtually inaccessible to people. Now, more than 2 decades later somehow, someone was pointing police right back to it. Intentionally, the department held a meeting the following morning to discuss next steps. Grant laid the letter on the table under a clear evidence sleeve and explained his findings to everyone. Some officers were skeptical immediately, calling it another hoax or an attention grab from someone, but Grant pushed back hard. The Polaroid from 1994 and the letter from 2018 now, both anonymous mailings, both referencing being close to home somehow. both hinting at the river location, felt too connected to dismiss as coincidence. Permission was granted for a limited search operation. Grant assembled a small team of officers he trusted, a forensic analyst, and 2 cadaver dog handlers with experience. On a cold morning in late January, they drove out toward the river's edge where the old Willow Bend Trail used to be years ago. What had once been a public path was now swallowed by nature completely. Trees had collapsed into the dirt. Vines hung thick like ropes blocking paths, and the air smelled faintly of stagnant water and silt mixed together. The team parked near the remnants of an old wooden fence barely standing. Then followed the faint outline of what used to be the trail decades ago. The river was swollen from winter rain falling, its edges soft and muddy underneath. The sound of the dog's paws pressing into the earth was the only noise besides the rustle of wind through the brush around them. For the first 2 hours, nothing happened at all. The handlers marked off small sectors carefully, scanning the ground for changes in soil texture or depressions that could suggest a burial site hidden. Then, around midday, one of the dogs suddenly stopped moving completely. Its nose lowered toward a shallow embankment where the land sloped down toward the water below. Seconds later, it barked sharply once, then again louder. The second dog followed immediately, circling the same spot repeatedly. Grant's heart began to race inside his chest. The handlers gave the signal clearly. Possible hit? The team marked the area and began carefully clearing away the overgrowth covering everything. Beneath the first layer of leaves and roots tangled, they uncovered a section of disturbed soil that didn't match the surrounding terrain at all. The dirt was compacted and darker looking, like it had been sealed off from the air for years untouched. They radioed for forensic support backup. Within the hour, crime scene technicians arrived with excavation tools and a portable canopy for cover. The dig began slowly and carefully, every inch photographed and logged properly. By evening, the spade of a technician struck something that wasn't soil underneath. The sound was soft but distinct enough, a dull tap against plastic material. They uncovered a large sheet of thick plastic slowly, the kind used for construction or insulation work, wrapped tightly together, and buried several feet deep below. When they peeled back the top layer carefully, the unmistakable shape of a human form appeared beneath it clearly. The scene went silent instantly. The remains were fragile but remarkably preserved considering time. The river mud, thick with silt and low in oxygen levels, had sealed the ground like a natural tomb protecting contents. Forensic technicians worked late into the night collecting samples and photographing every angle possible before carefully transferring the remains into evidence containers for transport. When the results came back days later from the lab, the confirmation hit like a wave across the department hard. The DNA was a match perfectly. Angelica Lewis, the little girl who had vanished from her front porch in 1992, had been found 26 years later finally. Less than 2 miles from her home where she lived, Grant sat in his car outside the apartment that night alone, staring at the photo clipped to the file folder. Angelica's smiling face frozen at 3 years old forever. He'd spent months chasing a 30-year-old ghost through files. And now he was looking at her case not as a mystery anymore, but as a crime scene that needed solving. Someone had taken her life away, wrapped her in plastic sheeting, and buried her within walking distance of the place she'd disappeared from that afternoon. The truth was darker than anyone imagined. The news broke quietly at first locally, just a short article in the Frankfort Daily Journal, announcing the discovery of remains believed to be connected to a decades-old missing child case finally. But word spread fast through town. Reporters called nonstop for statements. For the Lewis family, what had once been a lifetime of uncertainty turned into something darker and final. Confirmation. Carol Lewis, now in her late 50s and living alone, was notified in person by officers. The officers who visited her home said she didn't cry at first when told. She just sat in silence, frozen, her hands trembling slightly before she whispered anything out loud. I always told myself she was close, but the letter still hung over everything like a shadow. Who had sent it, and why now after all these years? Grant sent it for advanced handwriting analysis and forensic tracing immediately, but whoever had written it knew what they were doing clearly. No identifiable prints found, no trace DNA recovered. The postmark led only to a public mailbox in Nashville with no cameras. Whoever sent it didn't want to be found by anyone, but they wanted the body to be discovered. That paradox haunted Grant every day. He believed the writer wasn't trying to evade justice entirely on purpose. They wanted closure finally. They wanted someone to find what they couldn't keep hiding anymore from the world. In the days after the recovery, investigators began combing through the old case files again carefully, comparing names, alibis, and connections between people. The original list of persons of interest was short back then. Neighbors, family friends, distant relatives who lived nearby. One name in particular kept appearing throughout. David Lewis, Angelica's father. His timeline from that day in 1992 had always been airtight and verified. He was at work, verified by time cards and co-workers present. Still, there were inconsistencies no one had fully examined back then carefully. He had been the one to dig trenches behind their property for a garden the summer before Angelica vanished without trace. He had owned a roll of industrial plastic sheeting that was never recovered from anywhere. And now, 26 years later, a body had been found wrapped in the same material in the area. He once used to fish and camp regularly. Grant didn't say anything aloud at first to anyone, but the thought kept circling in his mind constantly. The letter, the guilt in its tone clearly, the reference to not being able to carry it anymore, didn't sound like a stranger writing. It sounded like someone close to her, someone who had watched the damage unfold year after year painfully. The discovery had answered one question finally, but opened several more that needed solving. The little girl was found at last, but the truth about what happened that night was still buried deep. Just in a different way now, and when investigators finally connected the evidence together, when they discovered who had written that letter sent, the story of Angelica Lewis would take one final devastating turn nobody expected. The DNA results came back on a cold February morning in 2018 finally. Detectives gathered around the small conference table in the Franklin County Sheriff's Department, their expressions unreadable as the forensics report was placed in front of them carefully. The analysis was conclusive and clear. The remains found at Willow Bend after 26 long years belonged to Angelica Lewis without doubt. For a moment, no one spoke at all. The name that had hung like a ghost in the department for decades was suddenly real again, written in black and white on paper. It wasn't a mystery anymore. It was a crime that needed justice, but the shock didn't stop there at all. Among the evidence collected from the site was a partial fingerprint lifted from the layer of plastic that had been wrapped around the small body carefully. The print was faint, almost lost to time passing, but the forensic team recovered enough of it to run through the system database. Hours later, the match came back with results. The fingerprint didn't belong to a stranger or an old suspect or a long-forgotten drifter passing through. It belonged to David Lewis, Angelica's father himself. Detective Harold Grant stared at the results for a long time silently, replaying the facts in his head over and over. David had been one of the first people interviewed in 1992 by police. He'd been at work the day his daughter disappeared from home. His alibi had checked out perfectly. He'd helped organize search parties, appeared on television beside his wife Carol, pleading for the safe return of their child to them. In the eyes of everyone who knew him, he was a father destroyed by tragedy completely. Now, suddenly, the evidence said something else entirely different. Grant reopened the file that afternoon immediately, spreading every old photograph, transcript, and map across the table carefully. He started from the beginning again. Angelica's disappearance, the timeline of that day, the neighbors' statements given. Nothing about the case had ever added up cleanly before. The lack of physical evidence found, the neatly staged scene, even the stuffed bunny left upright on the porch intentionally. All of it had felt just a little too deliberate and planned. If David Lewis had been responsible, it meant everything about the original investigation had been built on a lie from the start. Detectives began quietly retracing his life back then. They spoke to former co-workers from the auto shop years ago, now older and retired from working, and the picture they painted was far different from the devoted family man everyone had seen on camera back then. Back in 1991, a year before Angelica vanished without warning, David had been drowning in gambling debt heavily, frequenting underground poker games regularly, borrowing money from people who didn't forgive easily at all. There had been rumors of threats made, late-night phone calls coming, and tension at home building. Neighbors recalled hearing arguments between David and Carol in the weeks before the disappearance happened. One remembered him yelling about starting over completely. Another said he'd talked about moving somewhere new and leaving the mess behind them, but no one thought much of it then, really. Families argued sometimes. People said things they didn't mean. When the old financial records were subpoenaed from banks, the debt became undeniable and clear. David had taken out multiple payday loans in 1991, each one larger than the last one. By early 1992, his accounts were nearly empty of money, and he was behind on mortgage payments owed. He had told friends he was trying to figure things out. Somehow, investigators began building a timeline of that spring carefully. On the day Angelica disappeared, David had clocked in at work at 7:58 a.m. and clocked out just before 3 o'clock. Exactly, a schedule that left a small window of unaccounted time between leaving work and arriving home that day. The drive between the auto shop and the Lewis residence was only 15 minutes normally. In the original investigation, that gap hadn't seemed important at all. Now it was everything that mattered. Detectives brought him in for questioning downtown. At first, David denied everything they said. He looked older now than before, gray hair, deep lines on his face everywhere. A man worn down by years of silence and guilt. He listened as they read the forensic report aloud to him. The words fingerprint match confirmed clearly. His hands trembled slightly on the table surface, but he kept his voice steady somehow, insisting there had to be a mistake made. But when confronted with the photograph of the plastic sheeting material, the compositional match to the material once used in his old workshop space, and the fingerprint that placed him at the burial site physically, something inside him began to fracture and break. He put his head in his hands and for a long moment said nothing at all. Then, in a low voice barely audible, he told them what really happened that day. It had been an argument, something small, something he couldn't even remember how it started between them. Carol had left for the store to buy groceries and Angelica had spilled something by accident. A cup of paint water from the porch steps onto the floor. He'd been under pressure constantly, angry, exhausted from the debt piling up, the fear of losing everything they owned. He said he'd snapped suddenly. The next part came out in broken fragments through tears. Shouting, the sound of her crying loudly, a push and then silence afterwards. He claimed it was an accident completely, that he panicked immediately, that he didn't mean for it to happen at all. But what he described next wasn't the act of a man in shock truly. It was the methodical decision of someone covering up the truth deliberately. He wrapped Angelica's body in plastic from his garage carefully, placed her in his truck bed, and drove toward the river alone. He'd known the area since childhood growing up, had fished there dozens of times before. The place he chose to bury her beneath the willows wasn't random at all. It was a secluded spot only locals knew about, and the ground near the riverbank was soft enough, easy to dig into. Afterward, he returned home quickly, placed her stuffed bunny neatly on the porch steps, and called 911 to report his daughter missing from home. He confessed that in the days that followed after, while police searched the woods and helicopters circled overhead looking, he joined the volunteers and cried on camera because he thought that's what a grieving father was supposed to do convincingly. When asked about the letter that arrived in 2018 recently, David shook his head and said it wasn't him who sent it. That letter, as it turned out later, had been written by his sister instead, Mary Ann Lewis, a woman who distanced herself from the family decades earlier after falling out. Detectives tracked her down in Tennessee living quietly. She was 62, living quietly outside Nashville alone, and when shown the photograph of the Polaroid found, she broke down almost immediately crying. She told investigators that David had come to her in 1993, a year after the disappearance happened, During what she called a breakdown, he suffered. He had confessed everything to her in tears streaming, begging her not to tell anyone about it. She'd kept his secret all those years hidden, believing the truth would destroy what was left of their family completely. But as she got older with age, the guilt became unbearable to carry. When she saw news about the county's cold case digitization program in 2017 starting, she realized the case might be looked at again finally, and she decided to send the letter anonymously. She wrote it anonymously, never expecting anyone to find the body buried. She just wanted to give Carol closure before she died herself when detectives confronted David with his sister's statement clearly. He didn't argue back. He just nodded quietly, crying into his hands covering his face. He signed a written confession that night admitting everything. For Carol Lewis, the truth shattered what little peace she'd built over the years slowly. The man she'd defended for decades publicly, the man she'd mourned with daily, had been the one responsible all along for everything. When asked later how she processed it emotionally, she said simply, "I always thought I'd been living with grief. I didn't realize it was betrayal." The confession closed one of Frankfort's oldest cold cases finally, but the aftermath left deep scars on everyone. David Lewis was arrested and charged with manslaughter and evidence tampering officially. In his statement to the court read, he called it a mistake I've been paying for every day since it happened back then. The truth, however, was much heavier than that explanation. Because the story of Angelica's disappearance had never been about a stranger or a monster lurking in the dark shadows. It had been about something far more ordinary and far more devastating to understand. A moment of anger, a secret buried by guilt, and a family torn apart by the weight of both combined. But even after the confession was signed, one mystery still lingered in minds. The haunting words written on that old Polaroid photograph, still close to home. The message had been literal, yes, but it was also something more meaningful. A reminder that sometimes the truth isn't hidden in the shadows at all, really. It's right there, buried quietly beneath the surface, waiting for someone brave enough to uncover it finally. When the courtroom doors finally closed on the Lewis case officially, it felt like the end of an era for the small town of Frankfort completely. For 26 years, people had whispered about what might have happened to the little girl with the pink sandals worn, the one who disappeared from her front porch in broad daylight mysteriously. The discovery of Angelica's remains and her father's confession afterwards had finally brought the truth to light for everyone. But for the people who had lived through it, especially for Carol Lewis personally, it didn't feel like closure at all. It felt like loss all over again. David Lewis was sentenced to 35 years in prison for manslaughter and evidence tampering combined. In the courtroom, he didn't look defiant or angry at anyone. He looked empty inside. When the judge read the verdict aloud, he stared straight ahead blankly, his face pale white, his hands clasped tightly as though holding on to something only he could see clearly. Carol sat behind him, not in the family section reserved, but in the back row away from the cameras filming. Reporters described her as composed throughout, but those who saw her up close said she looked like someone who'd already cried every tear she had left. In her first and only interview after the trial ended, Carol's voice trembled when she said carefully, "I kept every birthday card made, every missing poster printed, every anniversary notice published. I just never expected the truth to come from a letter sent." She held the piece of paper as she spoke the same handwritten note that had arrived in the mail that January morning, the one that had finally led to the discovery of her daughter's remains buried. She said she didn't hate the person who wrote it honestly. "Whoever sent that letter did what I prayed for. They gave my daughter a voice again." The letter had come from Marianne Lewis, David's estranged sister living away. She hadn't set foot in Kentucky for nearly 2 decades before now. When investigators contacted her in Tennessee by phone, she admitted she'd written it after years of carrying her brother's secret burden. She said she didn't do it out of anger toward him, but out of guilt consuming her because she couldn't stand knowing that a child's grave was still hidden, while people prayed for answers desperately. "I thought it might destroy what was left of the family completely," she told police during questioning. "But then I realized there wasn't really a family left to destroy anymore." In the weeks after the confession came out, Carol's home became a museum of memory frozen. The walls were lined with fading photos and newspaper clippings yellowed, the air thick with the scent of old paper and flowers placed. On the table by the window sat a box she had kept sealed for years untouched. Inside were Angelica's favorite things carefully stored, her bunny, a pair of tiny sandals worn, and the missing posters that had once been stapled to telephone poles all over town everywhere. She opened that box for the first time in decades the night before David's sentencing hearing. She said it wasn't anger that made her do it finally. It was finality. Reporters who revisited the story in 2019 called it one of the most haunting cold case resolutions in Kentucky's history ever. It wasn't just because of how it ended tragically, but because of how ordinary it began that day. There were no strangers lurking in the shadows waiting, no mysterious kidnappers involved. Just a father who made an irreversible mistake and a family that carried the weight of that silence for nearly 3 decades straight. Detective Harold Grant, who had uncovered the Polaroid that reignited the case finally, later said that what struck him most wasn't the violence of the act itself, but the quiet of the years that followed after. Everyone kept living around a secret, he said. The mother, the sister, even the community around them. Everyone was moving forward, but the truth was sitting there, buried near a riverbank the whole time waiting. For him, the moment that stayed burned in his mind forever wasn't the discovery of the body or the confession given. It was the detail that tied it all together perfectly. The number painted on the mailbox in the Polaroid photo. 417. For months, no one could figure out what it meant at all. But during the final stages of the investigation continuing, county records revealed that before the flood of 1998 hit, an old mile marker 417 had stood less than 50 feet from the exact spot where Angelica was buried underneath. The number hadn't been a house address. It hadn't been random. It was a map clearly. A message pointing quite literally to where she had been all along. Close to home, that realization haunted Grant deeply. It meant that whoever took the Polaroid photo, most likely David himself back then, had memorialized the place where he left his daughter buried, marking it with the same cold precision as a gravestone would. It also meant that Marianne, when she found the photo years later among her brother's belongings stored, had probably known exactly what it meant and chose to send it back to the one place where it might finally matter most. After the sentencing, Grant visited the river one last time alone. He said he wanted to understand what kind of man could come to a place like that and bury his own child there. The air was still that day, the willows bending low over the water just like in the letter described. Standing there, he said, you could almost imagine hearing the echoes of search teams from decades before, calling Angelica's name into the trees desperately. Carol never went back to Willow Bend afterwards. She said it wasn't where her daughter was anymore, truly. Instead, she had a memorial stone placed in the small cemetery near her church, engraved with Angelica's full name and the dates that bookended a life far too short-lived. Beneath the inscription were 4 words of her own choosing deliberately. Still close to home that spring, she invited the few remaining friends who had stood by her through the years to a quiet service held. There were no cameras allowed, no speeches given, just a handful of people and a mother who had waited half a lifetime to say goodbye finally. She placed flowers at the base of the memorial and then unfolded a small frame she had brought with her carefully. Inside was the letter preserved, the one that had started everything, the one that ended it all. She placed it beside the stone gently, her hands trembling slightly as she whispered softly, "Now I know." The story of Angelica Lewis faded from the headlines after that completely. But in Frankfort, it never really left people's minds. People still point to the old river road, the one that used to lead down to Willow Bend, and talk about how long the truth can stay buried before it finally finds its way back somehow. Detective Grant retired later that year from service. The last case file he closed before leaving the department was Angelica's finally. He wrote just 3 words in the final summary line clearly. Recovered, confirmed, remembered. In the end, the mystery of the letter, the Polaroid, and the number 417 all led back to the same truth revealed. That sometimes justice doesn't arrive through evidence or luck alone, but through guilt eating away, through the conscience of someone who can no longer live with silence anymore for 26 years. The Lewis family had lived in the shadow of a lie hidden, and it wasn't a stranger's letter that finally set them free ultimately. It was the weight of truth carried across decades, until someone found the courage to speak it aloud finally, and on that quiet afternoon at the cemetery, with sunlight filtering through the trees and the wind moving softly through the grass, it felt as though Angelica's story had finally found its ending deserved. Not a perfect one, not a peaceful one, but a true one.